Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in the world of Auguste Rodin, the French sculptor, active, 1840 to 1917, often called the founder of modern sculpture, and, well, for good reason.
Absolutely. Rodin just had this incredible knack, for working with clay, creating surfaces that felt, well, alive,
Right.
full of movement, texture. It was really quite something for his time.
It really was, and even if you don't haunt art museums, you've probably seen his work. Think of The Thinker, right? That classic image of deep thought.
Oh, yeah. Or the kiss, that passionate embrace.
And the power of the monument to Balzac, the sort of solemn figures in the Burghers of Calais.
And the gates of hell, that massive, unfinished project.
Right. And what's really interesting is how controversial a lot of these now famous works actually were at first. His whole approach, it just broke from the established way of doing figurative sculpture.
That's such a key point.
Yeah.
Because back then, sculpture was often about, idealized forms, maybe just decoration. Rodin, though, he went for naturalism.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to show the human body as it really was, imperfections and everything. And he dug deep into individual character with this incredible intensity.
That commitment to capturing, the raw emotion, the physicality, it was definitely a departure. But even though people pushed back at first, his dedication, well, it eventually won him international fame. By 1900, he was a huge deal, sought after by wealthy clients.
And we can't really talk Rodin without mentioning his complicated personal life, especially his relationships with two really important women, Camille Claudel.
Ah, yes, his student, collaborator, lover, even rival, in a way, a really talented sculptor herself.
Absolutely. And then there was Rose Beret, his companion for, decades, who he finally married right at the end.
Both relationships were just massively influential, weren't they, on his life, his art, but in very different ways. So for this deep dive, our mission is really to get into the core of Rodin's life and his groundbreaking work based on what we found. Okay, where else to start but the beginning? His formative years.
Okay. So born in Paris, 1840, working class background, and interestingly, mostly self-taught, but you could see the talent early. He started drawing when he was just 10.
Right. And then from 14 to 17, he's at the Petite École, focused on drawing, painting.
That sounds like a pretty standard start.
Well, yes and no. The Petite École was crucial. His drawing teacher there, Horace Lecoq de Blainbaudran, he had this really progressive method. He pushed students to develop their own way of seeing things, encouraged drawing from memory,
Yeah.
really strengthening that internal eye.
So not just copying things.
Exactly. Rodin himself said it was a huge influence, and that's also where he met Jules Deleuze and Alphonse Legros, who both became pretty important artists, too.
Okay, so good early training, good connections, but then he hits a wall, right? The École des Beaux-Arts, the top art school. He tries to get in 3 times.
3 times, yeah, and gets rejected every single time, which is kind of startling when you think about who he became.
Definitely. Why do we think that happened? Were the exams that hard?
Not necessarily that hard. But these rejections, they were a real blow. The thinking is the judges were very much into the neoclassical style. Idealized forms, classical themes.
And Rodin wasn't doing that?
Not really. His leanings were more towards, say, 18th century sculpture, more expressive, so likely a clash of tastes. After leaving the Petite École around 1857, he ends up spending the next 20 years, basically, as a craftsman.
20 years. Doing what?
Making decorative things, architectural details, ornaments, earning a living.
That sounds like a long detour from his own art.
It was. He was honing his skills, getting really good with materials and form, no doubt, but it probably limited his chances to really explore his own voice, artistically speaking. Then, 1862, something big happens personally. His sister Maria dies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and apparently he felt a lot of guilt about it. It pushed him into this brief but pretty intense religious phase. He actually joined a Catholic order.
Seriously. From sculpture to a religious order.
Yeah, quite the shift. But interestingly, the founder of that order, St. Peter Julian Aymard, he saw Rodin's talent and maybe saw that, the religious life wasn't quite his path.
So he didn't stay.
No, Aymard actually encouraged him to go back to sculpture. So Rodin went back to working as a decorator, but he also started taking classes with Antoine Louis Barré.
Barré, the animal sculptor. His work is incredibly detailed, especially the way he captures muscles in motion.
Exactly. And you can see how that would appeal to Rodin, right? That focus on anatomy, on movement. Barré's meticulousness definitely left a mark on Rodin's own developing style.
Makes sense. And around this time, 1864, he starts his relationship with Rose Beret.
That's right, Rose Beret, a young seamstress. It was a lifelong relationship, though, often pretty complicated. They had a son, Auguste Eugene, in 1866.
So life's getting busy, work, art studies, family. And 1864 is also when he exhibits his first sculpture.
Yep. And he starts working as the chief assistant for Albert Ernest Carrier-Belleuse, a very successful, very established artist, especially known for decorative work.
Okay, so back working for someone else, but a prominent figure this time.
Right. He worked for Carrier-Belleuse until 1870, doing a lot of ornamentation design for buildings, roof elements, staircases, doors. Then the Franco-Prussian War interrupted things.
Did he fight?
Briefly called up, but his eyesight was poor, so he wasn't in for long. The war hit, the decorative arts trade hard, but Carrier-Belleuse got work in Brussels and invited Rodin to join him there in 71. They worked together on the Brussels Stock Exchange ornamentation.
So off to Belgium. How long was he there?
6 years. And those 6 years in Belgium were actually really pivotal.
Pivotal how? He was still mostly doing decorative work, wasn't he?
He was, but it was a crucial time for honing his technical skills. He got tons of practical experience working with materials, large-scale projects. The downside was his own personal art. It stayed mostly private. He didn't really have the money to get things cast in bronze.
Ah, okay. So skill development, but not much public exposure for his own stuff.
Pretty much. His relationship with Carrier-Belleuse soured again, but he found other work in Brussels, did exhibit a few things locally, and importantly, Rose eventually joined him there. And then, 1875 comes this really transformative trip.
Where did he go?
Italy, for 2 months.
Ah, the classic artist's pilgrimage. Who inspired him there?
Donatello, and especially Michelangelo. Seeing their work, their grasp of anatomy, the raw emotion in the forms, it just fundamentally changed him. He famously said, "It is Michelangelo who has freed me from academic sculpture."
Wow, that's a powerful statement. So Italy really lit a fire under him.
Absolutely. It directly led to him starting work on the Age of Bronze.
The life-size male figure, the one that caused all the trouble.
That's the one. It was so incredibly naturalistic, so lifelike for its time, that it immediately sparked this huge controversy. People accused him of surmelage.
Surmelage, what's that?
Basically cheating, accusing him of making a direct cast from a living model instead of sculpting it. They just couldn't believe sculpture could look that real.
Ouch. That must have been rough, being accused of dishonesty right as he's trying to break through.
It was a serious blow. The sheer naturalism fueled the rumors. Rodin fought back hard, denied it, even showed photos of the model to prove the differences. He demanded an official inquiry.
Is he cleared?
Eventually, yes, he was exonerated. But that whole episode really set the stage for his career. The artist challenging conventions, pushing boundaries, and facing resistance. That's why later on, he often made figures deliberately larger or smaller than life size, partly to avoid those accusations again.
Okay, so he gets past that controversy eventually. What happens when he gets back to Paris in 1877? Is it smooth sailing from there?
Not exactly. He returns with Rose to a pretty small flat. This is a tough time personally. His mother had died while he was away. His father was elderly, blind, not doing well. His son, Auguste, was also having difficulties. Rodin had been gone 6 years, and that relationship with his son always remained a bit distant.
And professionally, did the Age of Bronze fallout follow him?
Oh yeah, those accusations lingered. He was in a pretty tricky spot, personally and professionally.
So how did he keep going? How did he build his career from there?
Well, initially he had to take work collaborating with more established sculptors, doing public commissions, mostly memorials, architectural stuff, often in that sort of neo-Baroque style.
So back to decorative work again, in a way?
Partly, yes. He did try to get his own commissions for big public monuments, Diderot, Rousseau, Sadi Carnot, but none of those panned out initially. But crucially, during this time, he was also developing the ideas for his next major piece, St. John the Baptist Preaching.
Ah, yes. That one feels so different from the Age of Bronze. Much more movement.
Exactly. It feels like the figure is actually walking and speaking. And around 1880, things started to shift a bit. Carrier-Belleuse, his old boss.
The relationship was okay again.
Seems they patched things up enough. Carrier-Belleuse offered him a part-time design job at the Sèvres porcelain factory. Prestigious place.
Porcelain. That seems different for Rodin.
It was, but Rodin actually had this appreciation for 18th century aesthetics, and this role let him explore that. His designs for vases and ornaments were apparently a huge success, brought a lot of acclaim to Sèvres across Europe.
Interesting. So he's doing this sort of more traditional design work, but also pushing boundaries in his own sculpture?
Exactly. And the Sèvres work got him noticed in artistic circles. He started getting invited to show at the Paris salons. He was initially quite reserved, apparently, but As his fame grew, he became known for being more outspoken, maybe even a bit temperamental.
Okay. Fame changing him a bit.
Maybe. But importantly, he met the statesman Leon Gambetta, who was really impressed and introduced him to important government people, like Edmond Turquet, who was in charge of fine arts.
And that connection with Turquet, that was the big one, wasn't it? Led to a massive commission.
The game changer, yes.
Yeah.
Thanks to Turquet, in 1880, Rodin gets the commission for a huge set of doors, a portal, for a planned museum of decorative arts. This becomes the gates of hell.
Which he worked on for decades, right? Even though the museum itself never got built.
For the rest of his life, basically, it became this vast, sprawling project. And the commission came with a free studio, which was huge, gave him artistic freedom. He soon quit the Sèvres job to focus entirely on commissions like the Gates.
And the Gates itself is just incredible. So many of his famous pieces actually started as figures for it, didn't they? Like The Thinker.
The Thinker, The Kiss, many others. It was like his giant sketchbook, this fertile ground where ideas took shape and then often spun off into independent works.
And it's around this time, early 1880s, that Camille Claudel enters the picture.
Yes, around 1883. She was incredibly talented, only 18 when they met. Their relationship was, well, intense, passionate, artistically vital, but also incredibly turbulent.
She worked with him as a model.
As a model, yes, but also as a highly skilled sculptor in her own right. She assisted him on commissions, learned from him, influenced him. Her own bust of Rodin from that time was highly praised at the Salon.
So a real artistic partnership, but obviously complicated by the personal relationship.
Deeply intertwined, yes. And while he's pouring energy into the Gates, he's also getting other major commissions. The Burghers of Calais monument.
The one for Calais, commemorating the citizens. Very moving piece.
Very. And also the monument to Balzac. Both of which, again, really clashed with traditional tastes and stirred up controversy.
Seems to be a pattern. Yet despite the pushback, his status was clearly rising. He was even asked to be a judge at the Paris Salon in 1889.
That shows you how far he'd come within the establishment, yeah.
Yeah.
But personally, things were getting messy. Both Camille Claudel and Rose Beret were getting really frustrated with his double life, essentially.
He was living with Rose, but deeply involved with Camille.
Exactly. Claudel and Rodin even shared a studio for a while, blurring those lines even more. There's apparently a letter from Rodin to Rose expressing tenderness, but he just couldn't seem to commit fully to Camille, or perhaps couldn't untangle himself.
Which led to their split in 1898. A really tragic story, especially what happened to Claudel afterwards.
Terribly sad. Her struggles with mental health, her institutionalization, a devastating outcome. And later, Rodin had another relationship, starting around 1904, with the artist Gwen John.
Another artist and model.
Yes, Gwen John, a Welsh painter. She also modeled for him and became his lover. Apparently wrote him thousands of letters. But again, Rodin eventually distanced himself. Seems his intense focus on art often came at a high personal cost to those around him.
A complex figure, definitely. Okay, let's maybe zoom in on some of these key works we've mentioned, give them a closer look.
Good idea. Let's start early. The Man with the Broken Nose, 1864. His first piece for exhibition.
Right. You said it was unconventional. How so?
Well, it wasn't a smooth, idealized portrait bust. The face looked fragmented. The broken nose was right there, prominent. It was all about texture, the raw feel of the clay, the emotion in the face. The Salon rejected it at first.
But they accepted it later.
A marble version, yes. Which maybe shows tastes were slowly starting to shift, or perhaps acknowledging his skill even if the style was challenging. That focus on texture, even a sense of being unfinished, became a real hallmark.
Okay, then fast forward to 1877, the Age of Bronze. After the Italy trip, you mentioned Michelangelo's influence.
Definitely. You can see echoes of Michelangelo's dying slave in the pose, the way the body conveys emotion. Rodin was trying to fuse that Renaissance anatomical mastery with his own intense observation of the human form, movement, feeling. He studied his model meticulously.
And the result was too realistic for some people.
Exactly. So lifelike, it sparked the Sermillage accusations we talked about. Big debate, but the French state eventually bought it, which was a huge vote of confidence, despite the critics.
So after that controversy, maybe to prove a point, he does St. John the Baptist preaching in 1878, but makes it larger than life size.
But precisely. And where Age of Bronze is more static, St. John is all about movement, that stride, the gesture. Even though both feet are planted, there's this incredible sense of forward motion, of caught action.
He said something about capturing successive views, right?
Yeah, trying to show different moments of an action all at once in the sculpture. Really innovative, still got mixed reviews, but it did win third place at the Salon. So growing recognition, even if not universal love.
And then comes the commission for The Gates of Hell, that massive Dante-inspired project that became his life's work, more or less.
Monumental is the word. He worked on it from 1880 until he died, and it was still technically unfinished, based on Dante's Inferno. Just think, 186 figures in its final form, an overwhelming vision of torment, desire, struggle.
And so many famous pieces came out of it.
Absolutely. It was his laboratory. The Thinker, for instance, started as the poet intended to be Dante himself, sitting above the doorway on the lintel.
The Thinker is just so iconic now. What makes it so powerful, do you think?
Well, the pose itself is obviously contemplative. People see Dante, Adam, Prometheus, maybe Rodin himself struggling with creation. But it's also the physicality, isn't it? The intense muscular tension.
Yeah, he's not just sitting there calmly.
Not at all. The clenched toes, the way his back is hunched, the hand gripping. Rodin makes you feel that thinking is this intense, full-body effort, physical and emotional.
Right. Then there's the Burghers of Calais, the monument for the 6 citizens who offered their lives. He didn't portray them as unified heroes, did he?
No, and that was radical. He focused on their individual emotions, fear, despair, resignation, maybe a bit of defiance. Based on the old chronicles by Froissart, it makes them so much more human, more relatable than some generic heroic group.
But that caused problems too.
Oh, yeah. Especially his idea for displaying it. He wanted it off the high pedestal, down at ground level, so you'd encounter these figures almost face-to-face, underscore their vulnerability, their humanity.
Did they let him?
Not initially. The committee wanted something more traditionally monumental. It wasn't actually displayed the way Rodin intended until after his death. Shows you how long it took for his ideas to be fully accepted.
And his monuments to Victor Hugo and Balzac also faced resistance.
They did. The Hugo monument explored the artist and muse theme. But again, it wasn't what people expected. The plaster wasn't even cast in bronze until the 1960s.
Wow. And Balzac, that one really kicked up a storm.
Hugely controversial. Rodin spent years on it, trying to capture Balzac's sheer creative force, his personality. The final version, with Balzac wrapped in that big cloak, looking almost elemental, it was rejected outright by the society that commissioned it, called grotesque.
But it had supporters, too.
Oh, yes. Many saw its genius immediately. Kenneth Clark, the art historian, later called it the greatest piece of sculpture of the 19th century. Rodin actually paid back the commission fee himself. It wasn't cast in bronze and put up until 1939.
It just highlights how far ahead of the curve he often was, challenging people's ideas of what a monument, what sculpture should be. And beyond these big public works, he was just incredibly productive, wasn't he? Thousands of pieces.
Thousands. Busts, figures, fragments, plus paintings, watercolors, thousands of drawings and prints. Portraiture is especially important.
Why portraiture specifically?
Well, partly for acceptance, you know. Doing portraits of well-known people helped build his reputation. And frankly, it paid the bills. Gave him financial independence to pursue his more challenging projects.
Who did he portray? Anyone famous?
Lots of people. Fellow artists like Dalou, Carrie Belluz, Claudel herself, writers like Victor Hugo, George Bernard Shaw, politicians, society figures like the Countess of Warwick, composers like Mahler, important figures from South America like Sarmiento, French leaders like Clemenceau. His portraits are incredibly insightful.
Even a simple drawing can be significant, right? Wasn't there one found in that Gurlitt collection?
Yes, a study of a woman nude shows the enduring interest in literally everything he produced.
So let's dig into his aesthetic a bit more. What were the core ideas driving this unique style?
Well, number one is probably naturalism, really focusing on capturing character, emotion, the truth of the human form, rather than some idealized beauty or grand allegory. He consciously turned away from Greek ideals and the sort of decorative look of Baroque or Neo-Baroque stuff.
So focus on the individual, the physical reality.
Exactly. The body itself, its textures, the way light hits the surfaces. That's how he conveyed inner feeling. He really believed character showed in a person's physical features.
And you mentioned his skill with surfaces, modeling clay. How did that work?
He had this amazing ability to make the whole body speak. Think about it, the thinker. Again, it's not just the face showing thought. It's the tension in his toes, his back, his hands, like you said. Rodin famously remarked that his thinker thinks not just with his brain, but with every muscle.
That's a great way to put it. And what about his use of fragments? Pieces that weren't complete figures. That was pretty radical then, right?
Hugely radical. Things like The Walking Man, which is basically a torso and legs, or Meditation Without Arms. He presented these as finished works in themselves. He saw the fragment as potentially containing the essence of the artistic idea. It pushed sculpture away from just representing things towards exploring form and energy itself.
And thematically, what kind of feelings or ideas did he explore?
A lot of struggle, suffering, internal conflict. Themes that really feel modern, actually. You can see a connection to writers like Baudelaire, whom he admired. He also loved music, especially Gluck's operas, the architecture of French cathedrals, and was drawn to the emotional power in artists like Van Gogh and El Greco.
How did he actually work in the studio? What was his process like?
It was quite different from the academic approach. He didn't like stiff poses. He'd have models, often nude, just move around freely in the studio.
Really? Just walking around?
Yeah. And he'd make quick sketches in clay, capturing a gesture, a moment of movement and emotion, and then he'd refine those later. The key was always the hands-on work with the clay.
George Bernard Shaw sat for him, right? Didn't Shaw describe it?
He did. Shaw talked about Rodin's incredible touch, how he seemed to just bring the clay to life with his thumbs, adding tiny bits here and there. It sounds like a very intuitive, dynamic process.
So very different from carving marble directly.
Oh, completely. He modeled in clay first. Then he had a whole team of skilled assistants partitions who would do the technical work of making plaster casts, scaling things up, casting in bronze, or carving the final marble based on his plaster models.
So he wasn't carving the marble himself, usually?
Not typically for the large pieces, no. That was standard practice. But what Rodin did that was innovative was how he used those plaster casts. He'd have multiple casts made, and then he'd treat them almost like building blocks.
How do you?
He'd take an arm from one figure, a torso from another, maybe change the angle, and combine them to create entirely new sculptures. The Walking Man is a prime example. It's made from parts conceived separately and then radically joined together. That fragmentation and recombination was really ahead of its time.
Truly sounds like a pioneer of modern techniques. Okay, let's shift to his later years, say 1900 onwards. By then, his reputation was pretty solid internationally.
Oh, absolutely solid. The 1900 World's Fair in Paris, where he had his own pavilion, that really cemented it. Commissions poured in from all over the world, especially for portraits, gave him a very comfortable income.
And he attracted quite a following, right? Writers, artists.
Definitely. People like the poet Rilke, who even worked as his secretary for a bit and wrote a famous monograph about him. Writers like Octave Mirbeau, Huysmans, even Oscar Wilde were admirers.
Rilke living with him, that must have been quite an intense artistic environment. Where was Rodin living then?
He and Rose Beret had a place in Meudon, just outside Paris, a fairly modest country house, but it became a hub where he entertained lots of prominent guests. Later, he took rooms at the Hotel Buron in Paris itself. That's where the Musée Rodin is now.
Did Rose move with him to the Hotel Buron?
No, she stayed mostly in Meudon. And Rodin started an affair with the Duchesse de Choiseul around that time. He also mentored a young Russian sculptor, Moisey Kogan, always engaging with younger artists.
What about his reception overseas? We touched on Britain being supportive. How about America? Was it easy for him there?
Initially, no. It was a bit tougher in the U.S. His style, the nudity in some works, it didn't immediately click with some of the big American industrialists and collectors.
So how did he break through?
A key figure was Sarah Tyson Hallowell, an American curator based in Chicago. She was a tireless champion for him. She connected him with major collectors, the Palmers, Yerkes, Isabella Stewart Gardner.
Even though there was controversy, like at the Chicago World's Fair in '93.
Yes, his nudes caused a stir there, but Hallowell persisted, and eventually Rodin gained real traction in America. He was incredibly grateful to her, even gave her several important pieces, which later became part of major French collections after her death.
And Britain remained a stronghold.
Very much so. He visited regularly, had a loyal following. His friend, the artist Le Gros, helped introduce him early on, and the writer William Ernest Henley was a huge advocate. Figures like Robert Louis Stevenson, Robert Browning also supported him.
And he donated works to Britain.
Yes. In 1914, a significant collection, recognizing that strong support. He held honorary positions, too, like Vice President of the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts in Paris and President of the International Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers in London. Very established by then.
Creatively in those later years, what was his focus?
He became increasingly fascinated with the female form, explored themes of masculinity and femininity, and dance. He did numerous studies of dancers, lots of erotic drawings, too.
Dancers. Anyone specific?
He was very inspired by Isadora Duncan, the modern dance pioneer, and also dancers from the Royal Ballet of Cambodia when they visited France. You can see that interest in movement, fluidity in his later work.
And then right at the very end of his life, after being together for over 50 years, he finally marries Rose Beret.
Yes, in January 1917. But tragically, she died just 2 weeks later.
Oh, how incredibly sad.
It really is. And Rodin himself was frail by then. He fell ill and died later that same year, in November 1917, age 77.
Where is he buried?
In Meudon, where he'd lived with Rose for so long. And fittingly, a cast of The Thinker watches over his grave, serving as his headstone. There were some slightly grim accounts later from his secretary suggesting he might not have received the best care in his final days, suffering from the cold. A somewhat somber end.
Looking back then, his legacy, it's immense, isn't it?
Undeniable. His bequest to the French state, his studio, models, and the right to make casts from his plasters was incredibly important. It ensured his work would be widely seen.
Which led to the Musée Rodin.
Exactly. Founded in 1916, opened in 1919 at the Hotel Biron, it holds the largest collection anywhere. And he received top honors during his life. Commander of the Legion of Honor, an honorary doctorate from Oxford. He was seen as a giant.
Compared to Michelangelo, even.
Frequently. Seen as the greatest artist of his era. Now, interestingly, his popularity dipped a bit in the decades right after his death.
Really? Why was that?
Tastes change, maybe a reaction against his dominance. But since the 1950s, his reputation has soared again. He is now firmly seen as the pivotal sculptor of the modern age.
What parts of his work seem most influential now?
Well, that embrace of the unfinished, the fragment, definitely influenced 20th century abstract sculpture. But more broadly, he just revitalized sculpture, gave it back its power to capture deep human feeling, intellectual force, not just appearance. He broke the old molds.
He freed it up for experimentation.
Completely. He laid the foundation. And people still connect so strongly with the emotion in his work. The beauty and pathos he found in ordinary people, not just idealized heroes.
Pieces like The Kiss and The Thinker are just cultural touchstones now.
Absolutely. There are symbols recognized everywhere. Google even did a doodle for his birthday featuring The Thinker. Shows you his reach.
And his influence spread through his students, too.
Definitely. Many important sculptors passed through his workshop Bordel, Brancusi, though they often went in very different directions later. He also championed other sculptors like Malol and Mistrovich. His impact was huge, direct and indirect.
And his life story is compelling enough for films.
Several films, yes. Camille Claudel with Depardieu and Theogony, another focusing on her later years, and a more recent one just called Rodin. His life had plenty of drama. There's even a Rodin Studios building in New York City named after him.
But all that fame comes with a downside. Forgeries.
A massive problem. Rodin is apparently one of the most faked artists out there. There have been big scandals involving forged bronzes, forged drawings like those by Ernest Durig.
So provenance, knowing the history of a piece, is crucial.
Absolutely essential. France even brought in laws limiting the number of posthumous bronze casts that could be officially made from his plasters, trying to control the market and maintain authenticity. It's a constant battle, unfortunately.
So wrapping up our deep dive on Rodin, it's just crystal clear how revolutionary he was for modern sculpture.
Absolutely. That commitment to naturalism, the focus on emotion, the innovative techniques, and just the lasting influence, he really changed the game.
And thinking back to all that initial controversy he faced, his perseverance is pretty remarkable, sticking to his vision despite the resistance.
It really is. He had to fight for his art. And yes, his personal life was complex, sometimes messy, but the power of the work he left behind is just undeniable. It speaks so directly about the human condition.
It does, and maybe that's a good final thought for everyone listening. Think about how Rodin's embrace of the imperfect, the emotionally raw, even the unfinished, how that still resonates today, how it challenges those older ideas of just pure beauty or perfect form. What parts of being human do you see most powerfully captured in his sculpture? Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Welcome to Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping straight into something really fundamental for global economic history, the Bretton Woods system.
Yeah, it's huge. It basically set the financial rules of the game for, 44 countries? For about 30 years after World War II, right up to the mid-70s.
Exactly. And, you're probably here hoping to get a good handle on it quickly without drowning in academic detail. That's our goal, too.
Right. We want to unpack the key bits, where it came from, how it was supposed to work, and, well, why it eventually fell apart. Might even throw in a few surprising facts.
Yeah, and we know listeners come with different levels of background knowledge, so we'll aim to make it accessible but still insightful, just the important stuff.
It's kind of amazing when you think about it. This was the very first time independent countries actually negotiated a whole monetary order together.
So what was the core promise?
Well, there were a couple of main things. Countries agreed to make sure their currencies could be swapped for U.S. dollars, within a really tight 1% band around a fixed rate. And the big one, the U.S. promised that other governments could swap those dollars for gold at a fixed price, $35 an ounce.
And this led to the IMF and the World Bank.
Yep, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, still around today, obviously. The big idea was more cooperation. Stop countries from just devaluing their money to undercut each other.
Okay, so let's dig into the origins. Why then? Why after World War II?
Well, the planners were really looking back at the mess after World War I. They desperately wanted to avoid repeating that economic chaos, the political tensions, things like those massive war debts nobody could repay, and the banking crash in '31. Many felt that stuff paved the way for World War II.
Right, instability.
Absolutely. And then you have the 1930s, with countries basically trying to export their unemployment, these beggar thy neighbor policies.
How did that work exactly? Yeah. Devaluing currency.
Yeah, basically making your exports cheaper and imports more expensive. Though it's worth noting, some research suggests this maybe didn't boost inflation as much as intended, given the huge deflationary pressures already happening. It was a desperate measure.
And wasn't there also a problem with, speculative money flying around?
Oh, yeah. The 1920s saw a lot of that speculative capital flows making economies vulnerable. Then in the 30s, bam, trade barriers go up, investment gets harder. It was a fragile situation.
Sounds like a nightmare for central bankers.
It really was. They tried, but managing the crisis just at the national level, it wasn't enough. The lack of international coordination was a huge problem.
And you had these closed trading blocks forming too, right? Like Britain's Sterling area?
Exactly. Britain had its area, Nazi Germany had its own controlled system, and the U.S. They were really worried about unemployment hitting hard after the war ended.
So that's where the U.S. push for free trade and convertible currencies came from. They needed places to sell their stuff.
Precisely. If Europe and the Sterling area couldn't buy American goods, the U.S. economy would suffer. So the post-war talks were all about breaking down those barriers, no more beggar thy neighbor, and also trying to control that hot speculative money.
Now, I read there were different ideas about how to structure this new system. Keynes had one vision, Harry Dexter White for the U.S. had another.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Keynes, looking at the Depression, wanted a system that sort of forced surplus countries to help out the deficit ones. Like use your surplus to import or invest, or you might lose it. A bit radical.
And the U.S. plan?
White's plan, which largely won out, was more about setting up an IMF with a big pot of money to automatically lend to countries in trouble, stabilizing things without, importantly, the political strings we sometimes associate with the IMF today. It's interesting, though, people like Brad DeLong argue that on some key points where Keynes was overruled, history kind of proved Keynes right later on.
And it wasn't just the interwar chaos they were reacting to. The old gold standard itself got some blame for the Depression, didn't it?
Absolutely. Ben Bernanke, for instance, argued that the rigid, poorly managed gold standard actually made the Depression worse, amplified the downturns.
So the consensus by '44 was something regulated.
Yeah, very much so. Fixed exchange rates, but linked to the dollar, which was linked to gold. Plus, tight controls on currency movements to encourage long-term investment, not short-term gambling. That was the idea.
Okay, so let's talk about the design of the system itself. Free trade needs free currency conversion. That was key.
Exactly. The 1930s experience with floating rates, they saw that as chaotic for trade. But just going back to the old gold standard wasn't really on the table either.
Why not?
Well, for one, gold production wasn't really keeping up with world trade growth. And a lot of the world's gold was held by the Soviet Union, which wasn't exactly going to be a cooperative partner.
So enter the U.S. dollar, the star of the show.
Pretty much. It became the reserve currency. The U.S. promised to swap dollars for gold at $35 an ounce, but only for other central banks, mind you, not for regular folks.
Made it as good as gold.
Or maybe even better, because dollars could earn interest. So other countries then pegged their currency to the dollar within that tight 1% band.
Like a short leash.
Exactly. And they had to intervene in markets, buying or selling, to keep their currency within that band.
Didn't Keynes propose something else, a banker?
He did, yeah, a kind of world currency unit.
Yeah.
But the U.S. wasn't keen, so the dollar got the job. Another thing, If a country needed a big change to its peg, more than 10%, they needed IMF approval.
To stop those competitive devaluations again.
Right, but the condition was fundamental disequilibrium, and they never really defined that clearly. That caused problems later. Countries also needed enough reserves, mostly dollars, to defend their peg, and the whole system was kind of designed to discourage massive, destabilizing capital flight.
Which brings us to the IMF and the IBRD. How is the IMF set up?
Think of it like a credit union for countries. Members put in money currencies and gold based on their economic size. These were called quotas.
Bigger economy, bigger quota.
Yep. And if a country ran a temporary trade deficit, spending more abroad than it earned, it could borrow foreign currency from this IMF pool.
So if France needed dollars to buy U.S. goods, they could borrow from the IMF.
Exactly. A temporary cushion, so they wouldn't have to, say, slap on import controls or devalue suddenly, but they had to pay it back, usually within 5 years or so.
And the IMF kept an eye on things.
Yeah, that was the surveillance role, checking if countries were fixing their underlying problems. The U.S., being the big player, really saw the IMF as a tool to push for open trade, get rid of those currency blocks, lift controls. The idea was occasional agreed-upon exchange rate changes if there really was a fundamental disequilibrium.
Which, as you said, was a bit vague.
It was, and that vagueness later made countries hesitant to adjust when maybe they should have.
And power within the IMF, who called the shots?
Well, voting power was tied directly to those quotas. The U.S. had the biggest quota by far, about a third initially.
Giving them veto power, effectively.
On major decisions, yes. Plus, it was based in D.C. Lots of U.S. economists on staff initially. Harry Dexter White himself was the first U.S. executive director, though that became controversial later. So, yeah, U.S. influence was significant.
And the other institution, the IBRD?
The World Bank, basically. Its few job was reconstruction, mainly rebuilding Europe after the war. Later, its focus shifted more towards funding development projects in poorer countries, infrastructure, things like that. A big capital base to fund long-term growth.
Okay, so the system is designed, the institutions are there, but it didn't just click into place smoothly, right? You mentioned a dollar shortage early on.
That's exactly right. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the world was actually short of dollars. The U.S. economy was booming, exporting way more than it imported, piling up gold reserves.
But the system needed dollars to flow out of the U.S.
Precisely. For other countries to trade, they needed dollars. But dollars were scarce outside the U.S. The U.S. needed to run a deficit somehow, buy more imports, invest abroad, give aid.
Which wasn't happening initially.
Not enough. The system discouraged speculation, and U.S. tech was so dominant, why import much? So this actually spurred U.S. companies to set up overseas multinationals and led to big U.S. aid programs. Also, the IMF just didn't have enough money to cover Europe's huge deficits, and its rules prevented lending for reconstruction anyway.
So how did they fix the dollar shortage?
The Marshall Plan. That was the big one. Huge U.S. grants, not loans, grants to rebuild Europe.
A massive injection of dollars.
Exactly. From 47 to 58, the U.S. deliberately pumped dollars out through aid, like the Truman Doctrine and especially the Marshall Plan. They even helped Europe and Japan become more competitive traders again, rebuilding former enemies. The long game was creating prosperous trading partners.
And this is all happening during the Cold War's beginning?
The Soviets decided not to join the IMF, which really cemented the U.S. as the leader of the capitalist economic bloc. That big U.S. trade surplus gave Washington a lot of leeway in foreign policy, stationing troops, investing abroad. Some call it the Pax Americana.
Okay, fast forward. The shortage turns into the opposite problem, a dollar glut. How?
Well, world trade boomed in the 50s and 60s. The number of dollars floating around the world grew much faster than U.S. gold reserves, which stayed relatively flat. Around 1950, the U.S. balance of payments actually tipped into deficit.
So more dollars leaving the U.S. than coming in.
Right. They tried things like import quotas, but it wasn't sustainable. And this leads to what Robert Triffin pointed out, Triffin's dilemma.
Ah, yes, the famous dilemma.
The core problem. The world needed more dollars for trade liquidity, which meant the U.S. had to run deficits. But the more deficits the U.S. ran, the more dollars piled up overseas relative to U.S. gold holdings, which eventually shook confidence in the dollar's gold backing.
So the system needed the U.S. to run deficits, but those deficits would eventually destroy the system.
Basically, yes. It's a fundamental contradiction. And honestly, variations of this challenge, having one country's currency be the world's reserve, still pop up today. It's inherently tricky.
And they tried to manage the gold price, didn't they? The London gold pool.
They did. 8 governments pooled their gold reserves in 1961. The plan was to sell gold if the market price went much above the official $35 ounce and buy it back if it fell, sort of smoothing things out.
Did it work?
For a while, but it came under strain. Things like the Cuban Missile Crisis caused gold price spikes. They got harder and harder to hold the line.
And then other currencies got into trouble, like the British pound.
Yeah, the pound devalued in '67. That really ratcheted up the pressure on the dollar and showed how linked everything was. President Johnson was in a tough spot to slap on trade carriers or risk a massive run on gold and the dollar.
What happened?
Well, the run on gold intensified. Early '68, the London Gold Pool just couldn't sustain the selling needed to keep the price down. It collapsed. They even had to temporarily close the London gold market at the U.S.'s request. A desperate move.
A major turning point.
Definitely. After that, private gold markets traded well above the official $35 price. And countries like France kept cashing in their dollars for U.S. gold, draining those reserves. The peg looked increasingly shaky.
And other structural changes were weakening the system too.
Yes. European currencies, the Japanese yen, they all became fully convertible again.
Yeah.
Good for trade, but it meant money could move across borders much more easily, increasing interdependence.
And markets like the Eurodollar market grew.
It exploded, really.
Yeah.
Dollars held in banks outside the U.S. created this huge pool of international credit. It massively increased liquidity, but also volatility. These flows started to dwarf what national governments could control.
So money sloshing around outside the rules.
Pretty much. You had international banking groups forming that could shift vast sums for investment, hedging, or just speculating against currencies they thought were mispriced. Central bank control was slipping.
And countries were reluctant to change their official exchange rates, even if they were wrong.
Exactly. Which created these almost risk-free bets for speculators. If a currency looked undervalued, you could pile in, knowing the official rate provided a floor. If it didn't get revalued, you didn't lose much. If it did, big profits. Highly destabilizing.
Plus, the U.S. wasn't the only big economic player anymore.
Right. By the mid-60s, the EEC, the precursor to the EU and Japan, were major economic powers. There was growing resentment about the dollar's special status, this exorbitant privilege, allowing the U.S. to finance spending by running deficits. And as Cold War tensions eased a bit with détente, these economic disagreements came more to the surface.
And U.S. domestic spending was adding pressure, Vietnam, Great Society.
Oh, hugely important. Those massive expenditures pumped even more dollars out, fueled inflation in the U.S., and worsened the trade balance. The dollar became clearly overvalued.
While others, like the German mark and yen, were undervalued.
Correct. But Germany and Japan didn't want to revalue it, would hurt their exports. And the U.S. didn't want to devalue the dollar, a prestige issue. So, stalemate. All while those massive currency markets put relentless pressure on official reserves.
So U.S. gold reserves kept shrinking.
Dramatically. By 1970, the commitment to sell gold at $35 an ounce was just becoming impossible to maintain. Defending the peg was unsustainable. The world was flooded with dollars, the dollar glut.
Did they try anything else? I remember reading about SDRs.
Yes, special drawing rights. The IMF created them in '69, sort of an artificial reserve asset, valued against a basket of currencies. The idea was to supplement dollars and gold, provide liquidity without relying solely on U.S. deficits.
Did it work?
Not really, not enough to save the system. Their actual use was pretty limited, mainly between central banks and the IMF itself. A clever idea, but too little, too late perhaps.
And then, boom, the Nixon shock, August 71.
Yeah, that was it. Nixon facing deficits, debt, inflation. He just unilaterally pulled the plug, suspended dollar to gold convertibility, slapped on wage and price controls at home, added an import surcharge. No warning to other countries.
Just cut the cord.
Pretty much. Severed the system's anchor.
They tried to patch it up briefly, the Smithsonian Agreement.
They did, late '71. Tried to repeg the dollar slightly higher against gold, $38 an ounce, and allow wider trading bands, but it didn't hold. The U.S. Fed was focused on domestic issues, cutting interest rates, which just sent more dollars fleeing the U.S.
So other countries gave up.
By early '73, yeah, Japan, the major European countries, they just let their currencies float freely against the dollar. That was really the practical end of Bretton Woods fixed rates. The formal end came later with the Jamaica Accords in '76.
So Bretton Woods was done by the mid-'70s, but the idea keeps coming back, doesn't it? People talked about Bretton Woods through during the 2008 crisis.
They absolutely did. Leaders like Sarkozy explicitly invoked Bretton Woods, suggesting we needed that kind of fundamental rethinking of the global financial system. Even after the 2020 pandemic crisis, the head of the IMF called it a new Bretton Woods moment, stressing the need for global coordination.
So what does Bretton Woods Tessican even mean in that context, recreating the old system?
Not literally, no. It's more about capturing the spirit, the emphasis on international cooperation, a rules-based order, trying to manage global imbalances and promote financial stability. It acknowledges the original system had deep flaws, but the aspiration for cooperative global governance remains appealing, especially during crises.
Okay, so looking back, what was the overall impact and what are the main criticisms?
Well, on the plus side, it definitely ushered in a period of stability and strong growth after the war. That's undeniable. But its reliance on the dollar gave the U.S. enormous power and that ability to run deficits, the exorbitant privilege.
And the fixed rates. Good for stability, bad for flexibility.
Exactly. Provided predictability for trade for a while, but governments couldn't easily adjust monetary policy to purely domestic needs. As trade grew and U.S. inflation rose, holding it all together just got harder and harder. Its collapse led us to the floating rate system we have now, which has its own set of issues.
And the institutions, the IMF and World Bank, they've faced criticism too.
Oh, definitely. Lots of criticism over the years. Loan conditions, especially on developing countries, seen as too harsh, forcing austerity, funding projects with bad environmental or social outcomes. And this recurring critique that the IMF often seems more focused on protecting big financial institutions than on the welfare of ordinary people in borrowing countries.
Which fuels calls for alternatives.
Right. People talk about maybe going back to commodity-backed money or creating a truly global reserve currency like Keynes' banker, or even looking at things like cryptocurrencies. There's no consensus. So while Bretton Woods itself is gone, its legacy, both the good and the bad, really continues to shape how we talk about global finance.
So wrapping this up, our deep dive shows Bretton Woods was this, well, incredibly ambitious attempt to build a stable world financial order after total chaos. We've seen its clever design, centered on that dollar gold link.
And all the complex reasons it eventually broke down Triffin's dilemma, shifting economic power, U.S. policies.
Right, and the institutions it created, the IMF and World Bank, are still major players, constantly debated. The fundamental questions about how to best manage global finance, they haven't gone away.
Not at all.
So here's something to think about. Given how tough it was to build Bretton Woods, and how it eventually collapsed anyway, what fundamental principles do you think should guide any future attempts at international monetary cooperation, especially now, in our much more complex, multipolar world? Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through sources to find, well, the really interesting stuff.
And today, we're diving into Hesiod's Theogony.
A truly foundational text. We've got some notes here, mainly drawing from the Wikipedia overview to guide us.
That's right. And our goal is to get under the skin of this ancient poem. What's it about? How's it structured? The big stories, and why we still talk about it.
Okay, let's kick off with the name, Theogony. Sounds impressive.
It literally means the birth of the gods or their genealogy.
So right away, it's divine family history. Got it.
Exactly. And Hesiod's version, probably written around, say, 730 to 700 BC, it's this huge synthesis. He's pulling together all these scattered local Greek traditions about their gods.
So he's organizing it all, creating the master narrative.
Pretty much. How they came into being, how they ended up in charge of, well, everything, the cosmos.
And this is the first known Greek mythical cosmogono, the earliest big picture origin story we have.
As far as we know, yes. Before Hesiod, these stories were likely more fragmented, local. He gives it this epic scope.
Where does he even begin?
With chaos.
Okay, not my apartment then.
No. Think more like a gaping void, a dark, indefinite something. It's described as a divine primordial condition, the absolute beginning.
Right, a cosmic starting point. And the poem itself is substantial.
Oh, yeah, over 1,000 lines. And it's written in Epic Greek, the same dialect as Homer.
Which gives it that weight, that authority.
Exactly. It signals this is serious, important stuff. The written version we kind of know gets settled around the 6th century BC.
But maybe with later additions. You mentioned Typhon.
Scholars think so, yeah. It suggests these texts weren't totally static. They could be added to over time. Like the Typhon bit, lines 820 to 868 might be an interpolation.
Interesting. Now, something else jumped out at me, this kings and singers passage. What's going on there?
Yes. This is fascinating. Lines 80 to 103. Hesiod basically says, look, the muses gave me the poet a scepter and an authoritative voice.
Like kings used to have.
Precisely. He's claiming that poetic authority, his voice reciting the Theogony, now carries the kind of weight kingship once did. It's a bold claim about the power of his art.
Wow. So it's not just listing gods, it's a statement about poetry's place in the world.
Absolutely. And it reminds us, while we use it as a source book, it came out of a performance tradition. Think rhapsodes and competitions reciting these hymns.
So it's like a snapshot of a living tradition, not a fixed Bible.
Exactly. Dynamic, evolving.
Okay. Any outside influences? Did Hesiod borrow ideas?
Well, the sources mention possible links to Near Eastern myths, maybe older echoes from Mycenaean times. But later discoveries, like the Hittite kingship in heaven text, show this really striking parallel. The Kumarbi myth, it's very similar to the whole Uranus versus Cronus story.
So that theme son overthrowing father was maybe floating around the wider ancient world?
Seems likely, yeah. These patterns recur.
Okay, let's get into that. The succession myth. This sounds like the main event.
It's definitely central. It explains how power shifts violently from Uranus, the sky.
To his son Cronus.
Right, and then from Cronus to his son Zeus, who finally establishes lasting order.
So walk us through it. Uranus and Gaia, sky and earth.
They have a lot of kids. The 12 titans, the 3 giant cyclops, and the 3 hecaton chairs, 100-handers. Freaky stuff.
But Uranus wasn't a happy dad.
Not at all. He hated them, apparently. He kept them stuffed inside Gaia, inside the earth.
Ouch. Understandably, Gaia wasn't pleased.
Seriously, she's in distress. So she makes this super hard sickle adamant and asks her kids, who's going to punish Dad?
And only Cronus steps up.
Only Cronus, the youngest titan. Gaia helps him set an ambush, and, well, he castrates Uranus with the sickle.
Yikes, that's graphic.
It is, and super significant. It separates sky from earth, allows the titans to emerge fully, and Cronus takes charge.
And from the aftermath of that, more beings are born.
Yeah. From Uranus's blood hitting the earth, you get the Erinyes, the Furies, Agents of Vengeance, the Giants, and the Meliae, ash tree nymphs.
Okay, and Aphrodite?
From the severed genitals thrown into the sea. The sea foam, Aphros gathers around them, and boom, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, is born.
Wow. Beauty from violence. Okay, so Cronus is king now. Smooth sailing.
Not quite. He hears the same prophecy his father did. One of his own kids will overthrow him. Paranoia sets in.
Uh-oh.
So he marries his sister Rhea, but every time she gives birth, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, he just swallows them whole.
He swallows them. Okay, that's extreme parenting.
Tell me about it. Rhea's obviously devastated.
But she saves the last one, Zeus.
Yes. She gets help from her parents, Gaia and Uranus. They help her hide baby Zeus away in Crete.
And Cronus.
She wraps a big stone in baby clothes, gives it to Cronus, and gulp. Down it goes. He doesn't notice a thing.
Clever. So Zeus grows up safe.
Grows up strong. Then he comes back and forces Cronus somehow. The details are a bit murky to vomit up his siblings.
Must have been an awkward reunion.
You think, hi siblings, I'm Zeus. Dad ate you. Anyway, now they're all free.
And ready for a fight.
Oh yeah. First, Zeus frees the Cyclops, who Uranus and Cronus had kept locked up.
And they're grateful.
Very. They forge his ultimate weapon, the Thunderbolt.
Ah, the iconic Thunderbolt. Now things are getting serious.
This kicks off the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. Zeus and his siblings versus Cronus and most of the other Titans.
How long did that last?
10 long years, the poem says. A decade of divine warfare.
Who breaks the stalemate?
Zeus, on Gaia's advice again, frees the 100-handers. Their strength throwing massive boulders tips the scales.
And the Titans lose.
Big time. They get hurled down into Tartarus, the deepest pit, locked away.
So Zeus wins, king of the hill.
Almost. One last challenge. Gaia, maybe annoyed the Titans lost, produces Typhon with Tartarus, a massive, terrifying monster.
Oh, come on. Another one?
Yep. But Zeus, now fully powered up with his Thunderbolt, takes him down relatively quickly, zaps him, imprisons him. Order is finally established.
Phew. So now he's king?
Now he's king. Elected by the other gods, advised by Gaia, he starts dividing up the honors, assigning roles.
But there's one final twist to secure his rule, right? Metis.
Ah, yes. His first wife, Metis, goddess of cunning intelligence. There's a prophecy. They'll have a daughter, then a son, who will overthrow Zeus.
Same old story.
Exactly. So Zeus takes no chances. He swallows Metis.
He swallows his wife, this family.
I know. But Metis is already pregnant with Athena. So later, Athena famously springs fully formed from Zeus's head. He gives birth to her himself, in a way.
And by swallowing Metis, he incorporates her wisdom and prevents the birth of the son who would overthrow him. He breaks the cycle.
That's the idea. secures his reign permanently.
Okay, what a story. But theogony isn't just the succession myth, right? It's packed with genealogies.
No, absolutely. It lays out the whole divine family tree, starting from the very beginning.
So after chaos.
Spontaneously, you get Gaia, Earth, Tartarus, the underworld abyss, and Eros, desire. Eros is the driving force for creation.
And chaos itself produces.
Erebus, darkness, and Nyx, night.
And then they have kids.
Right. Aether, brightness, and Hemera, day. Light from darkness.
Meanwhile, Gaia, all on her own.
Produces Uranus, sky, her equal partner, plus the Aurea, mountains, and Pontus, sea. The physical world takes shape.
Okay, so the basic framework is there. Then Gaia and Uranus have their brood.
The ones we mentioned. The 12 Titans, Oceanus, Codius, Crius, Hyperion, Iapetus, Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, Tethys, and Cronus. Phew!
That's a mouthful. And the Cyclopes?
Brontes, Steropes, Arges, their names relate to thunder and lightning, fittingly.
And the 100-handers.
Caudus, Briareos, and Gyges, the heavy artillery.
So those are the first generations, but it keeps going, right? Nyx has more kids.
Loads of them, all by herself. Mostly rather grim concepts. Moros, doom, Thanatos, death, Hypnos, sleep, the unalloyed dreams. Also Momus, blame, Oises, pain.
Sounds like a charming bunch.
And Eris, discord or strife. And Eris, also alone, produces even more delightful things like Ponos, hardship, Lethe, forgetfulness, Limos, starvation, Algaea, pains, battles, lies. You get the picture.
Yeah, it seems Hesiod traced a lot of life's troubles back to night and strife. A bit pessimistic.
You could read it that way, yeah. Reflects the harsh realities of their world, maybe.
Okay, what about the sea deities? Gaia and Pontus.
Right, Pontus is the sea. Their kids are key figures. Nereus, the truthful old man of the sea. He marries Doris, and they have the 50 Nereids.
The sea nymphs, like Thetis, Achilles' mother, and Amphitrite.
Exactly. Then there's Thaumas, who fathers Iris, the rainbow messenger, and the Harpies, and Phorcys and Ceto.
They sound ominous.
Their children certainly are. They produce the Graeae, the old women sharing one eye and tooth, the Gorgons, including Medusa,
okay.
and the serpent Ladon, guarding the golden apples. A lot of monstrous figures stem from the sea.
Which tells you something about how they viewed the ocean: powerful, dangerous, mysterious.
For sure. And speaking of monsters, let's not forget Echidna and Typhon's kids.
Oh boy. The ultimate monster couple.
Their offspring are legendary. Orthus, Gerion's two-headed dog, Cerberus, Hades' three-headed hound, Lernaean Hydra, the Chimera.
It's a who's who of mythological horrors. The Sphinx, the Nemean lion too.
Them too, all from that lineage.
Okay. Deep breaths. What about the Titans' descendants? They must have populated the cosmos quite a bit.
Hugely important. Oceanus and Tethys give birth to literally thousands of river gods and oceanids, the nymphs of springs and streams.
Covering the whole world's waters.
Hyperion and Thea produce Helios, sun, Selene, moon, and Eos, dawn. The celestial bodies,
Cottius and Phoebe.
parents of Leto, who'd later bear Apollo and Artemis with Zeus and Iscaria.
Yeah.
And Hecate gets a special mention here too.
And Cronus and Rhea, we know them.
The original 6 Olympians.
Yeah.
Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, Zeus.
Iapetus and Clymene.
Their sons are very significant. Atlas holding up the heavens, Minucius struck down by Zeus, and of course Prometheus and Epimetheus, key figures in humanity's story.
It's like a map of the universe showing how all the forces and regions are related through family.
That's a great way to put it. It imposes an order, a structure on everything.
Now, Zeus himself, he was prolific. 7 wives listed in the Theogony.
He was. After Metis, there's Themis, divine order. She bears the Horai, good order, justice, peace, and the Moirai, the fates, Clotho, Lachesis, Atropos.
So lawfulness produces order, justice, peace, and fate itself. Makes sense.
Then Eurynoma, an Oceanid, bears the 3 chariots, the Graces, Aglaia, Euphrosyne, Thalia, beauty and charm.
Demeter, his sister.
Yes. Their daughter is Persephone, queen of the underworld.
Mnemosyne, Mnemosyne.
Gives birth to the 9 muses, all of them. Clio, Euterpe, Dahlia, Melpomene, Terpsichore, Erato, Polymnia, Urania, Calliope, the patrons of the arts and sciences.
Leto.
Mother of the twins Apollo and Artemis, hugely important Olympians.
And finally his sister and principal wife, Hera.
With Hera, he has Hebe, youth, Ares, war, and Eilephia, childbirth. Though Hesiod also says Hera produced Hephaestus all by herself, out of spite for Zeus producing Athena alone.
More family drama. So these marriages really establish the core functions of the Olympian regime.
Exactly. Order, law, beauty, the arts, the next generation of powerful gods. It all stems from Zeus's strategic unions, you could say.
Are other divine children mentioned beyond Zeus's main line?
Oh, yes. Poseidon and Amphitrite have Triton, the merman messenger. Ares and Aphrodite's affair produces Phobos, fear, Deimos, terror, and Harmonia, harmony, ironically.
Fear, terror, and harmony from war and love. Interesting mix.
Isn't it? Then there's Hermes, son of Zeus, and the nymph Maia. Heracles, son of Zeus, and the mortal woman Alcmene. Dionysus, son of Zeus, and mortal Semele.
So demigods and gods born from mortals are included too?
Definitely. Also figures like Circe and Medea's father Aeetes, children of Helios and Perseus. It branches out widely.
Which leads nicely into that other category, children of goddesses with mortal men.
Right, blurring the lines further. You have Demeter and Iasion having Pleiades, wealth. Harmonia and Cadmus, the founder of Thebes, have kids like Ano and Agave.
Eos, the dawn, seems to have had a few mortal partners.
She did. With Tithonus, she had Memnon, the Ethiopian king. With Cephalus, she supposedly had Phaethon, though that lineage varies.
And some really famous heroes stem from these unions.
Absolutely. Thetis and the mortal Peleus have Achilles. Aphrodite and the Trojan Anchises have Aeneas.
Aeneas, founder of the Roman line.
That's the one. Even Circe and Calypso are listed as having sons with Odysseus, though those might be later additions or traditions Hesiod included. Figures like Medea and Jason's son Medeus, too.
It really emphasizes how connected the divine and human worlds were believed to be. Gods weren't totally remote.
Not at all. They were actively involved, for better or worse, in human affairs and lineage.
Okay, we absolutely have to talk about Prometheus. He gets significant attention.
He does. The story starts at Mecone, where gods and mortals are sorting out sacrifices. Prometheus tries to trick Zeus.
How so?
He makes two piles from a sacrificed ox. One looks good, glistening fat, but it's just bones underneath. The other looks unappetizing in the stomach, but has all the good meat hidden inside.
Trying to get Zeus to pick the bad pile for the gods?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Zeus sees through it, the poem says, but he chooses the bones covered in fat anyway, perhaps to have a reason to be angry. And that sets the precedent. Humans get the meat, gods get the smoke and bones.
An origin story for sacrificial practice. Clever. But Zeus wasn't happy.
Not happy at all. As punishment, he decides to withhold fire from humanity.
That's harsh.
But Prometheus, the great champion of mankind, steals it back.
Yes.
Sneaks it down from heaven, hidden in a hollow fennel stalk.
Bold move. What was Zeus's reaction to that?
Even angrier. First, he arranges for the creation of Pandora, the first woman, sent as a beautiful curse, a punishment for men receiving fire.
Pandora and her jar or box of troubles.
That story isn't fully detailed here, but her creation is Zeus's indirect punishment. The direct punishment for Prometheus, much worse.
Chained to a rock.
Chained to a cliff in the Caucasus. Every day, an eagle comes and eats his liver.
Ouch. And it grows back.
It grows back overnight, because he's immortal, so eternal torment. Until Heracles eventually comes along and frees him, with Zeus's permission eventually. It's a huge saga about defying the gods, the price of knowledge or progress, and the relationship between humanity and the divine.
An absolutely iconic myth. Okay, stepping back from the stories, what's the legacy? How did Theogony influence things later on?
Its influence on early Greek philosophy was pretty massive. You see, by trying to lay out the whole story, the origin of everything in a structured way.
It gave people a framework.
Exactly. It modeled the very idea of trying to explain reality as a whole. This desire to find the fundamental principle or origin of all things, arguably gets a huge boost from Hesiod.
So philosophers looked at Hesiod's chaos and thought, okay, but what is the ultimate starting point?
Pretty much. Chaos itself is like a proto-arch. Then you see thinkers like Thales saying, no, it's water. Anaximander proposes the epiron, the boundless indefinite. Xenophanes moves toward that idea too. They're building on, or reacting to, the kind of totalizing explanation Hesiod attempted.
So mythology paved the way for philosophy, in a sense.
In a very real sense, yes. It framed the questions.
What about much later Christian interpretations?
Yeah, the notes mention some interesting takes. John Milton, writing Paradise Lost, apparently saw Hesiod's gods as maybe inspired by fallen angels, like Satan, a corruption of the real cosmic story.
So not fiction, but a distorted version of truth.
Kind of. And some early church fathers, like Justin Martyr, had similar ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Pagan myths were seen as demonic distortions of actual divine history or prophecies. They engage with it and just dismiss it.
Fascinating. And how does Theogony stack up against other creation myths? Babylonian, Norse, etc.
There are definitely common threads and interesting differences. The Orphic myths, another Greek tradition, have Chronos, time, and a cosmic egg.
Right.
Vedic traditions in India talk about creation from nothingness or from
Right.
primordial waters, similar to the Babylonian Enuma Eliah, which also starts with watery chaos, Apsu, and Tiamat.
And the Norse.
They have Jinunga Gap, the great void between fire and ice. So this idea of a void or primordial waters or darkness as the starting point is really widespread.
But Hesiod's version is unique in its focus.
I'd say its emphasis on genealogy, on procreation and strife, as the drivers of creation from that initial chaos is quite distinctive. It's very much a story of family, power struggles, and the gradual imposition of order through successive generations.
Okay, well, this has been quite the journey through divine births, battles, and swallowing relatives.
It covers a lot of ground.
Clearly, the Theogony is so much more than just a list of who begat whom. It's this epic narrative about power, how the cosmos got organized, how order defeated chaos, or at least contained it.
Absolutely. And its influence stretched from ancient poets to philosophers to later religious thinkers. It's a cornerstone.
It really gives you a powerful glimpse into how at least one part of the ancient Greek world saw the very fabric of reality being woven.
A foundational text in every sense.
So here's something to chew on. As you hear these ancient stories about the origins of power, these intense struggles for cosmic control, how does that resonate today? Does understanding these foundational myths about establishing order change how you think about power structures, conflicts, and the forces shaping our own world?
Definitely food for thought. There's always more to explore with Hesiod and comparative mythology.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Theogony.